Chapter 28 Millennium. 5 years after Mum received her inheritance, Jane and Peter, who had married whilst in America, went to China together to teach English. They were there for nearly a year. Mum had always hoped to live to see in the millennium and was excited at the thought of seeing in the new century. Together we watched the celebrations in China on television, thinking of Jane and Peter and marvelling at the wonderfully exuberant Chinese fireworks, then saw in the new millennium here. There was no point in trying to sleep. The noisy celebrations went on and on for most of the night. Early in 2000, Miranda and Tom moved back to Cardiff, to a large house in Roath opposite the park, and I was very happy that Mum would be able to see Miranda more often. It also gave me more confidence in planning the trip we wanted to make to China, as Mum would have help close by if needed. In May, John and I flew to Beijing to join Jane and Peter for a 3-week holiday. I felt bad at leaving Mum because she had spent a day at the hospital a few days before and had picked up a very severe tummy bug there. But Miranda assured me that she would take good care of her while I was away. We were waiting in Frankfurt Airport for our connection to Beijing, and I decided to phone Miranda to see how Mum was. The good news was that although she had had a very bad night, she was now much better. The bad news was that Miranda had gone down with the same bug. As I had spent a lot of time with Mum the day before, I felt uneasy about this, but so far we both felt fine, so John and I had a snack while we waited to be called for our flight. Through the window we could see the huge plane that was to take us on our long journey. Although I like seeing new places and would like to go almost anywhere, I do hate flying, and I put the unpleasant sinking feeling in my stomach down to apprehension. We flew for hours. Meals seemed jumbled up, coming at odd times, a combination of pseudo-German and pseudo-Chinese food. Day changed to night, and night to dawn. For a long time we flew over mountains and desolate places, and as the morning progressed, we both began to feel ill. The flight attendant came with immigration forms we had to sign to say we hadn't been sick in the past 48 hours. I signed it and hurriedly handed it back. I felt awful, but still thought it might be the lengthy flight and lack of sleep that was making me feel so bad. John was very quiet. We both refused breakfast. Fortunately, we were seated at the back of the plane close to the toilets. It wasn't long before we were putting them to good use. I was too ill to really appreciate the sight of the Great Wall of China below us, zigzagging its way into the distance. It was with real relief that we eventually staggered off the plane. We needed to make several stops at public conveniences inside the airport, and as we stood in the queue to have our papers checked, we both had to grab the sick bags we had taken from the plane and discreetly throw up behind convenient pillars, guiltily depositing the full bags in bins for the poor cleaners to find later. We didn't want the officials to refuse us entry after making such a long journey. People are often afraid of picking up bugs in foreign countries, but we brought our own bugs with us into China. It was wonderful to see Jane and Peter again, and once the virus had run its course, we had a very interesting and enjoyable holiday, travelling far south together, first to Shanghai, then Hangzhou, and then on to Yangzhou near Guilin. I love those Yangzhou landscapes that looked just like old Chinese paintings, but at the same time I was anxious to see Mum again and to reassure myself that she was better. By late summer, Jane and Peter had left China. They were going back to the States in the new year, but were staying with us for a few months until then. Mum was so happy to see Jane again and to have her home for a while, although one day she said sadly, "You know, Chrissy, I don't think Jane wants to have any children. I'm feeling very sorry about that, for you and for Jane." I know she doesn't. But Peter does, and I think that perhaps one day she might change her mind. Yeah, I hope so, Chrissy. I do hope so. Mum was spending a lot of time lying down on the divan in the living room she now used as a bed. The double bed she had bought for herself when she got her inheritance was no longer used. Her divan was an adjustable bed. She could raise the head and the foot to the most comfortable position, but was still in a great deal of pain most of the time. The polymyalgia rheumatica had not got any better, and all her other conditions were getting worse. I asked at the library if I could take compassionate leave without pay for 6 months in order to give me more time to care for her, but was refused. So I did what I could with the time I had available. She had daily help now for an hour or two, but said she was always relieved when her helpers went away and left her in peace. Very often, when her pain was extreme and I could do nothing for her, I would go home close to tears, and often I couldn't hold them back. I was so sad for her that I felt I was already grieving for her in many ways. On good days she still loved playing a game of Scrabble, but rarely managed more than one game before her back gave out and she had to lie down, although in the past we had usually had 2 games in an afternoon. Very often I thought, this can't go on, and very often Mum would say, I don't want to go on living with all this pain, Chrissy. She had been a member of the Euthanasia Society Exit for years, and I sometimes wondered that if her pain was too much to bear, she might give up and take all the pills that I had carefully sorted out for her each week, just to end her suffering. I was often afraid that when I went to see her I might find her lying dead in bed, or, which I thought might be even worse, find her unconscious from an overdose. What would I do then? Go against her wishes and get her resuscitated? I don't know how I would have reacted, but it went through my mind a great deal. Would I have been able to just close the door and walk away? I often felt quite nervous about opening her front door, and was always immensely relieved when she called out, I'm just having to lie down for a little while, Chrissy. Come in. It was in November 2000 when Miranda went round to see Mum late one morning. One of her helpers was there and told her that Mum was in bed, feeling unwell. Miranda called the doctor, who suspected a heart problem, and suggested that Mum should really be in hospital. He knew Mum's independent spirit well, and although he advised her, he didn't insist. The fact that she agreed shows just how bad she must have been feeling that day. The ambulance came, and the paramedics gave her an ECG, and then took her to Llandoch Hospital. Miranda went with her in the ambulance, with sirens blaring all the way. Once there, Mum had to wait hours for a bed, and eventually Tom phoned to ask if I'd go to the hospital to relieve Miranda, as she had had neither lunch nor supper. I think I must have been working that day, otherwise I would probably have been with Mum at the hospital already. For a few days she was in intensive care, and seemed to be recovering. She was transferred to a geriatric ward, and considered herself to be very lucky when they put her in a bed by the window, where she could look out at the trees in the hospital grounds and watch people coming and going throughout the day. She didn't look at all well, but we still had hope of seeing her in her own home again soon. This was a time when we really had a full house. Apart from John and myself, there was John's mother and Jane and Peter, who had the top floor to themselves. However, we all ate together in the evenings, so as well as visiting Mum in hospital and going to work, there was shopping and cooking to do. The others helped, but I was so used to doing it all that I just carried on keeping everything as close to normal as I could manage. One evening I cooked a large stew for the following day, and as the fridge was too full to accommodate the huge stew pot, I decided that it would be cold enough in the cellar to store it there overnight. I began carrying it down the cellar steps, which were very badly lit. I missed the bottom step and fell with a scream and a crash and a lot of chicken stew onto the stone floor of the cellar. I could hardly get up, and the pain in my ankle was intense. A visit to the hospital proved that I had broken it. I would have to be in plaster for some time. I had no idea how I was going to manage. I had to go and see Mum no matter what. A broken ankle was not going to stop me. Now the family all rallied round splendidly. At least I was signed off from work for a while. I gradually learned how to cope with using crutches, dressing myself, getting up and down stairs on my bottom, much to the amusement of my lovely son-in-law, and directing operations from a comfortable sofa in the living room. John or Miranda took me every day to the hospital to visit Mum. Sometimes, when John took me in, I stayed with her while he went off to work. The hospital had wheelchairs that I was able to borrow, and Mum and I carried on playing Scrabble to pass the time. However weak her body was, her mind remained as sharp as ever. She could still beat me at Scrabble. One day when we were there, we thought Mum looked very poorly. She told us that she wasn't eating anything because she couldn't swallow. Alarm bells started to ring for me then. "What about your pills? Can you swallow them?" She looked a bit vague. "I don't know. I don't think so. How could I if I'm not able to swallow?" We asked the nurses. They looked pretty vague themselves. Those pills I had been carefully sorting out for Mum for years were what were keeping her going. "How many days has she not been taking them?" "I'll check. We'll look into it." "Well, do it now and make sure she gets what she needs. If she can't swallow them, surely she can be given the medication some other way." I'm not sure now if this was quite fair, as Mum had a phobia of needles. Perhaps it was better to let things take their natural course. When John came to fetch me, Mum called him over to her bed. "John, promise me you'll get a proper light put on those cellar stairs. Promise me?" "I promise. Of course I will." He told me later that he didn't like the look of Mum's skin. It had, he said, a waxy appearance. By then Miranda and I both knew in our hearts that Mum would not be going home. The next morning we got a phone call from the hospital urging us to come as quickly as we could. I was particularly slow that morning at getting ready. Everything was slow with that heavy plaster on my leg, but that morning I seemed to be dragging myself along. When Miranda arrived to take me to the hospital, I was still in my dressing gown. She looked impatient, but years later she told me that she felt bad already because someone had delayed her on the street to ask about Mum, and she'd spent longer than she ought talking to her. Eventually we got going. We both knew that this was it. This was the day, 17th of December, and the anniversary of Hans's birthday, when we were going to lose our darling Mum. I was terrified, for myself, for my future life. How do you cope when the sun goes out? "I hope you can find me a wheelchair quickly when we get there." I don't remember that there was much more conversation during that drive. Miranda parked the car close to the geriatric wing of the hospital. From the car park we looked up at Mum's window. Today, the curtains around her bed were drawn shut. My throat tightened. She's gone. We're too late.